Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
I am a scientist, not a philosopher.
Friedrich Nietzsche said God is dead. Stephen Hawking said philosophy is dead.
Science may have replaced religion, but has it also replaced philosophy?
I'm curious as to what transpired between the moment when I was nothing more than an assemblage of parts in Dr. Soong's laboratory and the next moment when I became alive.
Can philosophy teach us anything that science can't?
You guys gotta tell me, why is there so much human suffering?
This is unanswerable.
Is there a God?
These are the wrong questions.
Has philosophy made any progress at all?
I've gotta find meaning.
Our guest is Massimo Pigliucci from City University of New York.
Has science replaced philosophy? Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
I am a philosopher, not a scientist.
Welcome to Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm not. I'm Ken Taylor. We're back at our old friend, the studios of KALW San Francisco.
We're continuing conversations that started at Philosopher's Corner at Stanford. That's where Ken and I teach philosophy.
And today we're asking a burning philosophical question. Has science replaced, killed off philosophy?
Well, Ken, of course, science has not replaced philosophy. Science and philosophy both aim at truth, but they employ different methods. They have different roles to play, and to a certain extent ask quite different questions. Who would even think that science could replace philosophy?
Well, lots of really smart, famous, prominent people, John. Steve Hawking has declared the death of philosophy. So is the biologist Richard Dawkins. They all both seem to think that science either can or will soon answer all the important questions. Anything left over, any so-called philosophical questions left over, those are just pseudo-problems and not really worth smart people thinking about.
Well, has Stephen Hawking or Richard Dawkins or any of these other scientists offered empirical evidence for this view? Have they done some experiments? Have they derived this from evolutionary theory or quantum mechanics? Of course not. The claim that philosophical problems are just pseudo-problems is itself a philosophical position, not settled by empirical facts. Sort of ironic.
Well, yeah, you're right. And we philosophers have a name for the kind of view that Hawking and others espouse. It's called positivism, logical positivism. Part of that was the claim that any statement that can't be verified or falsified empirically, scientifically, is just nonsense. When you're talking about it, you're just flapping your lips. But you've shown a problem with positivism. It actually fails its own test.
Yeah, so I guess we can forget about these guys. I mean, Hawking and the like have rediscovered an old philosophical position. And they say that philosophy doesn't make any progress.
Yeah, okay, John, I get your sarcasm. Maybe, positivism is dead, but it's a real question. Has philosophy, we've been around for a long time, 2,000 years at least. Has philosophy made any progress in 2,000 years? Indeed, give it 2,000 more years. Will we make any progress?
Well, it's nutty to say it hasn't made any progress, especially nutty for scientists to say that. Philosophers have played an important role in the birth of each science, from mathematics in ancient times to physics in the 16th and 17th centuries. And in more recent times, psychology, computer science. I mean, for goodness sakes, of course we've made progress.
Well, John, you definitely have a point. I mean, it's only in the last few centuries that science has even been considered a separate discipline from philosophy. What we now call science was once for centuries in the West called natural philosophy. And all the major figures, Aristotle, Descartes, Newton, Galileo, they all regarded themselves as much philosophers as scientists. So you're right about that.
Okay, then we can agree. Psychology, mathematics, linguistics, computer science, all of these disciplines were once under the larger umbrella of philosophy. So if any of these disciplines has made any progress, if any of them has gotten closer to the truth, then philosophy gets part of the credit. Just because we don't call these modes of inquiry philosophy anymore doesn't mean there's been no progress in our discipline in the last 2,000 years.
Yeah, but that's like the mother taking a credit for the achievements of her children. I mean, the children have grown up and left the nest. But if the only progress that we've made in these two millennia is by developing new sciences that do a better job with our old problems, then maybe the scientists have a point. Here's the question. Is there any way to make progress within philosophy instead of all the progress ultimately being a move away from philosophy?
So you're asking questions like the existence of God or the nature of right and wrong. I guess you're saying if the only progress we've made in 2 millennia is developing new sciences, not answering those questions, we're kind of failing, I should say. Well, I guess that's a fair question. But I think it's a mistake to assume that philosophy should make progress in the same way that science does. We may get clearer about issues as time goes on, even if we don't come up with these final and agreed-upon answers.
But see, no final and agreed-upon answers. That's the thing that bugs scientists so much about philosophy. Philosophical questions can't be settled. They can't be settled by empirical facts. They can't be settled by the relentless philosophical arguments. And I think many scientists see this lack of consensus, lack of convergence at an agreed-upon answer as a signal. We're asking the wrong kind of questions. That's why they think they're pseudo-questions.
Well, we're asking questions that are difficult and important. Take morality, for example. You could have all the facts about how a particular act might affect everyone concerned, but would that tell you if it's right or wrong? It's not so clear to me that it would. And even if we agreed that a certain thing is the right thing to do, we may disagree on why it's the right thing to do.
Well, there I agree with you. Empirical facts may inform lots of philosophical theories, should inform philosophical theories, but I don't think they automatically provide direct answers to the really big questions. But, even though you and I agree, lots of people don't agree with us. So we sent our roving philosophical reporter, Caitlin Esch, to find out about what some real-life physicists actually think about the role of philosophy in the great scheme of knowledge. She files this report.
Philosophers have not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics.
A few years ago, renowned cosmologist Stephen Hawking pronounced philosophy dead.
What is the nature of reality? How does the universe behave, and why does it exist? Most of us don't worry about these questions most of the time. But almost all of us must sometimes wonder, why are we here? Where do we come from? Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead.
In terms of understanding the details of how the universe works, philosophy is dead. That's the domain of science, and it's taken it away from philosophy.
Lawrence Krauss is a physicist. He directs the Origins Project at Arizona State University.
But reflecting on the implications of that for our existence, certainly those kind of questions are, I think, important questions, and philosophers, as well as anyone else, should be thinking about those.
Krauss's 2012 book, A Universe from Nothing, explains how the world came to be from the perspective of a cosmologist.
You can get everything we see, all of the 100 billion stars and 100 billion galaxies, 100 billion stars per galaxy with 100 billion galaxies. All of that mass can come from literally nothing without violating the laws of physics.
The book quickly became a New York Times bestseller, but it also ruffled a few feathers.
Now, it is true that I made a joke or two in the book, which I probably provoked, specifically in talking about nothing, that some people, over the time I've talked about this subject, object to my definition of nothing, and I lumped philosophers and theologians together and said that they object, some of them, to a discussion of nothing, but that they're experts at nothing.
The book bothered theologians for its implications about God, and it bothered some philosophers who disagree with Krauss's definition of nothing. Krauss's nothing is the kind defined by the quantum field theory, where the laws of physics are already in place. It's a kind of nothing that some philosophers have insisted is actually something. To Krauss, that's just semantics.
It's just some in the philosophy community who have a very insular view, and I think a defensive view that somehow scientists are infringing on their territory by discussing what they view as philosophical concepts that I really hadn't experienced before.
Krauss says, in the end, the world needs science, but science doesn't need philosophy.
Philosophers of science are read by philosophers of science. Scientists don't read them. Philosophy has no impact on science nowadays.
Krauss admits that philosophy is useful in so much as it encourages thought and reflection.
Science is what generates knowledge. It's the place to turn to understand nature. Philosophy doesn't help us understand nature. What it helps us understand is perhaps our relationship with nature. We reflect on the implications of what science discovers for our own existence. And that kind of reflection is the kind of thing that everyone does, but philosophers, I suppose, do it professionally.
For Philosophy Talk, I'm Caitlin Esch. And now back to the professionals.
Thanks, Caitlin. It's nice to hear that Professor Krauss is a little more enthusiastic about philosophy than he was in his book. I'm John Perry. With me is my fellow member of the despised community of philosophers, the Stanford philosopher Ken Taylor.
And today we're asking the question, the live question, whether science has replaced philosophy, has killed philosophy. We're joined now by Massimo Pigliucci. He's a professor of philosophy from the City University of New York. He's author of Answers to Aristotle, How Science and Philosophy Can Lead Us to a More Meaningful Life. Massimo, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Massimo, you started your career by getting a PhD in genetics. Then you got a doctorate in biology, too. And then, if that wasn't enough, you got a PhD in philosophy. How did that happen? Did somebody forget to tell you that philosophy was dead?
I guess so. What happened was that I went through a midlife crisis as a scientist. And instead of buying myself a red sport car or something like that, I figured, well, why not follow my natural inclination, which seemed to be at that point pretty clearly, to try to address broader, conceptual questions in science. My career as a biologist was largely in evolutionary biology, and there is quite a bit of philosophy of science that has been done in that area. So I realized simply that that area was very close, was contiguous to philosophy of science, and I didn't want to play, however, philosopher as a naive scientist, and so I went back and actually got a graduate degree. My naive expectation or hope was that my science colleagues who knew my publications in that field would take me seriously as a philosopher, and then my philosophy colleagues would take me seriously because I had actually the training as a scientist, but I spent the time to do it from scratch in philosophy. The result often, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite, that I'm too much of a scientist for the philosophers and too much of a philosopher for the scientists. Go figure.
Okay, Massimo. Now, sounds like it didn't turn out quite the way you expected. Now, we heard Hawking say that philosophy was dead, and then Professor Krauss said, it's okay if professionals want to think about these things, but no scientists read them or take them seriously, and they have no impact. Is that right? Is that a minority view, a majority view, or a universal view? Do scientists still read philosophy? Some of them, sometimes?
That's a good question, and I wish that somebody had done a sociology of scientists' thesis to address the question empirically. My sense is that actually a majority of scientists don't even think about these things, that a good number of them do get involved in philosophy. There is a good number of biologists and physicists who publish philosophy papers in technical journals, often in collaboration with philosophers. So overall, I would have to guess that Hawkins and Krauss's position is actually a minority. I particularly like Krauss' comment that is, only philosophers of science read philosophy of science papers. Besides the fact that I don't think that's true, one could equally easily retort that only cosmologists read cosmology papers. So what? Yes, these are technical fields. It's not surprising that only people with technical degrees and expertise in that area read those particular papers.
Well, I don't sit around reading cosmological papers in the raw, but I do read secondary stuff about a lot of them. And it seems to me that Krauss's position, if I understand it, that somehow the laws of quantum physics were in place before there was anything to obey those laws. That sounds like theology to me. What do you think?
Well, that is one of the borderlines, certainly, between cosmology and fundamental physics on the one hand, and philosophy. I wouldn't go all the way into theology. On that ground, I'm closer to Krauss's position. But, Krauss seems to, and Hawkins seems to ignore that there is actually a good literature in metaphysics that does take very seriously the discoveries in fundamental physics. There's a book that came out a couple of years ago by James Lediman and Don Ross, for instance, called Everything Must Go. Which is about modern naturalistic metaphysics, taking physics seriously, and they do. And reading that book, it's actually quite difficult because it does take seriously both the physics and the philosophy. So there are people that are working on these things, and there are people that are in fact taking seriously the interface between the two fields.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Our guest is Massimo Pigliucci. He's author of Answers to Aristotle, How Science and Philosophy Can Lead Us to a More Meaningful Life.
Well, what is the relationship between science and philosophy anyway? Are they completely independent modes of inquiry? Are they continuous with one another? Is the difference just that one gets funding from the government and the other one doesn't?
Science, philosophy, and the never-ending quest for knowledge. When Philosophy Talk continues.
She blinded me with science.
Have philosophers and the rest of the thinking public been blinded by science? I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor, and we're questioning whether science has replaced philosophy.
Our guest is Massimo Pigliucci from the City University of New York.
Massimo, I want to go back to something John said in the opening, that he diagnosed this belief that science has killed philosophy by saying, well, all these guys are without knowing it, are positivist. They believe that there's no questions except empirical questions, that anything that can't be conclusively empirically verified or disconfirmed is meaningless, is just gibberish. So since science answers all the empirical questions, there's nothing left for anybody else left to do. Do you think John's diagnosing that right? Is he correctly diagnosing the source of this dismissal of philosophy?
I think so, actually. What I would call a positivistic attitude or a scientific attitude more generally, that is the idea that the only meaningful questions are the ones that can be answered by science, is in fact widespread among scientists. Now, often they don't actually, most science practitioners don't actually think about this stuff on a regular basis. I mean, they're busy running grant proposals and running experiments in the lab and things like that. But occasionally there are scientists like Hawkins and Krauss, often not in technical publications, but in books aimed at the general public, who do muse about these things. And perhaps they're, I don't know, maybe there's also some kind of an Oedipus complex there. I mean, you guys mentioned earlier that science used to be natural philosophy, and if it is true that current philosophy certainly cannot take credit for the discoveries of science just because philosophy is the mother of science, I don't know. It seems to me that this sort of very nasty attitude that some scientists have against philosophy is misplaced. After all, we're not competing for their money anyway.
Well, right. Well, so let's put another question, a related question. So we're not competing for their money, but are we competing for their kind of explanatory turf? I mean, are we doing the same thing as science, but maybe doing it badly? Are we doing something different from science? I mean, what's your relationship between whether science and philosophy are competing, continuous, complementary, or just completely different kinds of inquiry?
That's an excellent question, which does really go at the root of the problem. No, I don't think that science and philosophy are the same thing. If they were, then either one of them would be right, but not both. Right. I have my way of looking at it is that science and philosophy are contiguous to some extent, which means that there are some areas of philosophy that are very close to science, and those in particular deal with certain areas of metaphysics, certain areas of applied logic, for instance, and of course mathematics. And of course, all of the philosophies of, right? There's a large, throughout the 20th century, there's been a number of new disciplines within philosophy of science, which in fact has then split into philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology, philosophy of chemistry, and so on and so forth. Those areas tend to be contiguous, meaning that they don't address directly scientific questions. We got science for that, but they do think about the way science works and the way science sometimes doesn't work. So it's about epistemology, for instance. And then there are other areas of philosophy that are pretty far, and they go increasingly remote from science per se. Most of ethical theory, for instance, is pretty remote. Now, I don't think you can do moral philosophy without paying attention to facts. But I also am quite convinced that there is no such thing as a scientific answer to questions like, is this thing right or wrong?
No, Massimo, I think you said a lot there, and there's a lot of different things, and I think I agree with the general spirit. But I'm going to push back maybe a little. I'm not sure how hard of a push it really is, because I think of myself as what philosophers like to call a naturalist. I mean, there is no spooky stuff in the world. There are no spirits. There's all just natural stuff happening. Everything, human consciousness, freedom. It's all part of nature. Science helps us to understand how nature works. So the philosophical, if you assume that everything that there is part of the natural world, and if you assume that science is the main enterprise we have for understanding how nature works, isn't philosophy at least going to collapse into science or something? I mean, be deeply constrained by science somehow?
Well, that's a good way to put it. But I think another way of thinking about this whole problem is that science, philosophy, and in fact a few other things, I would put in there logic, if you want to consider that as separate from philosophy, and mathematics, they all belong to a broader understanding of the concept of knowledge, which until a few years ago went under the name of scientia. Scientia is a Latin term that literally means knowledge in a broad sense. Now, science deals with empirical knowledge of a particular type. One of the things that my science colleagues, and remember, I'm a scientist myself, so it's not like I don't understand where they're coming from, but one thing that my science colleagues do when they want to push back against philosophy is to claim that, it's all about facts and science is the only thing that deals with facts. So in the end, it all comes down to science. But that is a far too expansive, I think, definition of what science is. If we equate science with just taking in facts about the world, then, two can play the same game, and I can define philosophy as anything that thinks or any way of thinking, therefore we're all philosophers. Clearly that doesn't help.
Yeah, I see.
So a better model is one of continuity where, yes, there is facts, but science actually has very particular ways of getting at facts. Some facts science simply cannot get at. For instance, in my own field of evolutionary biology, there are important questions about the way in which gene and environments interact. And as far as human beings are concerned, those questions are very difficult for a variety of reasons. You can't do the proper experiments. Human beings are awful experimental subjects because they're long-lived. There's ethical questions. You just can't go around crossing people according to the theory of genetics and that sort of stuff. That means we're left with partial, incomplete information about which we have to do the best we can in terms of sort of thinking about what it means. And so science itself doesn't have all the answers that it pretends to have.
Well, now, I must admit, I'm skeptical about where you're drawing the line, you and everybody else, except maybe me. I would draw the line not between philosophy and science, but between cosmology, the really far-out physics that comes to conclusions like, there was nothing but the laws of physics still applied. Or as Einstein himself said, how do we fit time into this? There's this bizarre but intellectually a very rigorous attempt to figure out how the mathematics of all this stuff can be made to work, and they come up with really bizarre stuff like the multiple worlds hypothesis and this and that and the other thing. But that's really not part of the big enterprise of figuring out how things work. The big enterprise, I think philosophy is part of. We take time seriously, and cosmology is just kind of something over on the edges. Now, I bet you don't agree with that.
Well, I wouldn't disagree the way you just put it, but I think it's not. I think there's something beyond that difference. Let me give you an example. So, cosmology does deal, of course, with what cosmologists themselves would consider sort of the big fundamental questions about, the ultimate nature of reality, which is, of course, historically what metaphysics has been about. Now, here's an interesting situation. A physicist a few years ago published a book called The Trouble with Physics. That's Lee Smolin. And in it, he sort of tried to diagnose why, in his opinion, it is that theoretical physics has lost an entire generation in the last 30 years, meaning that the theoretical advances that have been made have not actually been matched by equally compelling sort of experimental results. And he was talking mostly about string theory. Now, nobody probably knows much about string theory, including string theories themselves. But one of the things that is clear about string theory is that it actually is a huge family of theories. It's a huge family of mathematical models which allegedly describe the fundamental structure of the universe, and yet there is no way that people have figured out over the last 35 or so years to actually test any of this empirically. Now, Smolin says that there are several reasons for that, one of which, ironically, is that in his opinion, his colleagues in modern fundamental physics don't take philosophy seriously. He said that
I like
previous
this
generations, yes, the previous generation, people like Einstein and Bohr and so on and so forth, realized the difference between a mathematical theory with empirical predictions, that makes empirical predictions on the one hand, and the need to interpret the meaning of certain theories. Now, we often hear, what's your favorite interpretation of quantum mechanics? Is it the Copenhagen school or is it the multiverse school? These are interesting terms because we're talking about interpretations. Science is about, the actual facts on the ground. And if you ask some quantum mechanicists or some physicists who work in that area, they'll say that they're not interested in interpretations. They belong to the shut up and calculate school of thought. Because that's what the science is about as far as they're concerned. And they're right.
Massimo,
when it comes to interpretation, yes.
I want to break in here for a second because there's something you said, a lot of different things. I want to back up to one thing that you said about how this all fits together. Einstein and all those folks you said took philosophy seriously, and I think there's a big important thing here because I do think philosophy is different from science, though deeply continuous with it. And here's one way I'd put it: philosophy is often concerned with the how possibly. Right, the how possibly question. How possibly in a universe in which there's just the quantum flux could there be freedom? How possibly in a universe in which everything at the bottom is just matter could there be an objective right and wrong? And philosophers go about that really hard. Those how possibly questions are asking us to take a walk through our imagination and revise our concepts and all that sort of stuff. They're not generating experiments that put that to the test. A lot of physics, though, at the highest level, is like that. I mean, string theory is like that. So it's very much continuous with philosophy, but blinded by a sort of positivist mindset, the physicists fail to see the deep resemblance between the fundamental enterprise of philosophy, how everything fits together, where it's not just all settled by the facts, but sometimes we have to reconfigure our concepts, answer how possibly questions. They fail to see the deep continuity between what they do and what we do, and the partnership that we can have. What do you think about that?
I agree. And there is, I agree. And then the way you just put it is actually analogous to one of the ways in which I try to explain to my students, the difference between and the overlap between science and philosophy, which is this. Science, of course, is in fact concerned largely or exclusively with empirically testable propositions. Philosophy is concerned, as you put it, with the exploration of essentially logical possibilities. So philosophy operates in logical space. Now, a subset of that logical space is in fact physically true. It actually realized in our universe. And when it comes to moving from the broader logical space of possibilities to the actual space of physical stuff, then I think that's where you see the transition more clearly between philosophy and science. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the line of demarcation is not and cannot be very sharp. It doesn't really matter whether it is a philosopher or a scientist who contributes to a particular question. It's a contribution.
I think you're exactly right. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're asking, has science replaced philosophy? Jim in Berkeley's on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Jim.
Hi. A couple of things. I don't think that philosophy can be completed until all of the physical universe and its myriad possibilities are known. And one of the examples I might give is physicists that have talked about recently that only about 3% of the universe is observable and known, but the bulk of it is dark energy and dark matter, which is theoretical and inobservable. If they're correct, until that can be shown and proven, it's really just a philosophy.
So thanks for the call, Jim. So what do you think about that? So he's making a pretty strong charge, stronger than I've made. I said philosophy and physics and science are continuous. He says science is nothing but philosophy, at least at its cosmological level. What do you think about that?
I guess I would disagree with that specific example. I mean, the facts on the example are correct. It is certainly the case that according to physicists, we do only have access to a very small percentage of matter in the universe. But it's not like the philosopher can come in and say, yeah, well, I'll tell you about the remaining 97%. No, we really don't have anything to say about that remaining 97%. It still is a scientific question. It simply is the kind of scientific question that ought to make people pause about when they're talking about science in terms of essentially an omnipotent way of looking at things. No, it's not. Science is always provisional, it's always temporary, and it's actually much more limited than some people seem to think. But no, I don't think that's a good example of where philosophy can come in, because we don't want to define philosophy negatively as anything that science can't do, that's philosophy.
So Massimo, I want to get a factual question to you. What was that book that you mentioned that it sounded like I would like, and who was the author?
The author is Lee Smolin,
Smolin.
S-M-O-L-I-N, and the title of the book is The Trouble with Physics.
Okay, and I just want to say something in support of what I took to be his thesis. Einstein wrote a very famous letter to Carnap once saying he was really dissatisfied about his treatment of time. Philosophically, I mean, he thought the conclusions were pretty sound, but he couldn't see how if there was really no absolute difference between the present and the future, how any of our ordinary experience of time could be explained. And he obviously was upset by that. Carnap gave some kind of Kantian half-digested answer, but that seems right. That seems like the right relation. Scientists ought to be bothered by what they're saying about ordinary facts about human experience, and philosophers ought to try their best to help them. So I'm all for Smolin, having not read his book.
Yes, and as we said earlier that we shouldn't be thinking about a sort of sharp demarcation lines. And I would challenge people like Krauss and Hawking, who, by the way, I bet have not actually read a paper in philosophy of science, despite the fact that they talk about it. I would challenge them to pick up an article, technical article in philosophy of cosmology or in philosophy of fundamental physics. And without looking at the names of the authors, telling me if the authors were physicists or philosophers. Often you can't tell. And in fact, often they're collaborators.
Massimo, that's true. And in fields like that, philosophy is highly technical. The philosophers who do it are highly attuned to the physics and are trying to make sense of it. I want to go step back a second to something you said in response to that caller. Yeah, we only know a small set of the universe. The observable universe is probably only some small percentage of the entire universe. And that raises a philosophical question. I just want to show how philosophy can take off from the deliverances of science. Take that fact and now ask the question, another how possibly question, how possibly, given that we can observe only such a small sample, how possibly could we have laws that cover the whole, right? I mean, and that's an epistemological question, and it's a puzzling question, and physics isn't going to tell you the answer. I mean, physics doesn't even raise that question for itself. I mean, do you think that's right or not?
That's correct. That is correct. And in fact, there is, for instance, a huge discussion in biology particularly about the very concept of a law of nature. Biologists who, again, I can speak here for first-person experience because I am a biologist. A lot of biologists sort of have this obvious physics envy. Since physicists tell us that physics is the queen of all sciences, then everybody wants to be like the queen. And one of the things that biologists want to do often is to come up with laws analogous to the laws of physics, so to establish basically their discipline on sort of firmer and more universal foundations. The problem is that there's a lot of interesting discussion about what actually counts as a law of nature. And that's an epistemological and even in some sense a metaphysical discussion. Definitely. Where philosophers have actually contributed a lot.
And it's a very, very deep and hard question, to tell you the truth. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're talking about science and philosophy with Massimo Pigliucci from the City University of New York.
Is there still work for philosophers to do, or should we all just pack it in and leave the difficult questions for science?
Science and the future of philosophy, when Philosophy Talk continues.
Weird science, weird scientists. Oh, what us poor philosophers have to put up with. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence, whether that's a philosophical intelligence or a scientific intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor. Our guest is Massimo Pigliucci, author of Answers to Aristotle, How Science and Philosophy Can Lead Us to a More Meaningful Life. And we've got Keith in San Francisco on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Keith.
Thank you. I'd like to reframe the question. Based on what our guest has said, I'm defining science as empirically based problem solving and philosophy as logically based problem solving. And the way I'm defining or reframing the question is, are there humanly important questions which can't be empirically based or solved? If the answer is yes, then there is a place for philosophy as we defined it. If the answer is no, then there is no place.
Oh well, that's putting it nice. That's the crucial experiment. That's the positives would have said, Massimo. What do you think about
That's right.
Keith's comment?
Well, the distinction that he's trying to draw may be a little too sharp for my taste, but I think it's fundamentally correct. And it does go back to what I was saying earlier, distinction between empirical questions and logical space, exploring logical space. The answer to the second question, are there logical questions in logical space that are relevant to humanity? Yes, there are. For one thing, I think that ethics is it's a type of reasoning. It's not really about answering questions as much as articulating questions, exploring the consequences of certain assumptions, and so on and so forth. So moral philosophy, political philosophy, they tend to deal a lot with exploring logical space of certain options. They're not independent on data. They're not independent on empirical information. I don't think that any serious philosopher ought to consider himself or herself independent of empirical stuff. But a lot of the work is actually not done empirically. And of course, logic itself.
Massimo, I want to add something to what you had to say. I think it's really important. I accept Keith's distinction roughly, and I accept your answer, but I want to amplify both because I don't think there's in principle, I don't think it's a gap so much as a scale of continuity. I said philosophy is often about how possibly could there be consciousness in a merely material universe. Imagine the difference between Descartes asking that question. He gave the answer. It couldn't possibly be the case that consciousness was just material. Why? Because he didn't understand much about matter. Right? He lived in a time when the properties of matter were not very well understood. When we're asking that question, we're asking it in a different context, and we have to take on board. I think philosophy questions are often how possibly questions, but how possibly given what we know from all the deliverances of the human mind. So that I don't think it's pure logic versus pure facts. It's kind of like back and forth. And someday there may be a convergence point where we know everything that there is to know, all the facts there are to know, and then all the how possibly questions reduced to, given all the facts that there are, how possibly this? And then I don't think would be a big, huge difference between scientific inquiry and philosophical inquiry.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get anytime soon to that kind of future. But I think
agree.
You're right. Yes, absolutely. The distinction, again, is one of degrees, and it is one of context. But it's also important to consider that both science and philosophy are done within a certain context. For instance, if you ask a typical scientist today, or if you check an introductory textbook in physics or biology, and you look at the sort of philosophy of science that they present in that textbook, it's outdated by at least half a century. Most scientists just don't keep up with the philosophy of science. They don't seem to realize the philosophy of science actually has made progress in things that actually are pertinent to the way we understand science itself. So yes, both science and philosophy change over time within each other's context. As I said, philosophers better take into account the best of what science has to tell us, but I think it would be wise of scientists to take into consideration the best of what epistemology, logic, and metaphysics tell us.
So that kind of leads into a couple of questions that have come in by email from our listeners, and both of them, by the way, mention Aristotle, the subject of your book. So you might like these questions. Paul says that, look, our picture of philosophy our original question was, philosophy make progress? Why do we expect philosophy to make progress? Well, he blames that on Aristotle. But he says Epictetus and the Stoics had a much different picture of philosophy that wouldn't lead us to think that it made progress except for the individual. And then one of our perennial emailers, Greg Slater, says, science never looks back. Philosophy and religion are always looking back. Aristotle is relevant to them. For scientists, who cares? You never give credit to the discredited. So tell us something deep and profound about Aristotle's role in all of this.
Well, the reason Aristotle is in the title of the book is precisely because he's one of the first people who looked at both science and philosophy. He realized that, yes, you do need logical analysis, arguments, and the sort of reflection on things, but you also need empirical data. I mean, he actually did field biology work on the island of Lesbos, of all places. But he was aware that, let's say, as opposed to Plato, who favored much more sort of these rationalistic approach to philosophy and sort of had somewhat of a disdain for empirical information, Aristotle was the first one to realize that, no, these two things, if you want knowledge knowledge in the broad sense, as the word that I mentioned earlier, scientia, you need both because there is no sharp and divided line. But because there are different kinds of questions that can benefit from a combination of approaches,
but Massimo,
I think we need both.
Massimo, if Aristotle were to walk into a university and visit the different departments, and he visited the physics department, and then he visited the biology department, he'd say, "Oh my God, I got it completely wrong. I was just spinning my wheels. I was completely wrong." And he walked into the philosophy department into a seminar on, say, I don't know, virtue ethics or something like that, or voluntary action. He would say, "Hey, man, I'm pretty darn good. I got it right." So the things that, the philosophers do in many of the things, Aristotle's still relevant. The things that the physicists and biologists do, Aristotle's like yesterday's long dead news. Doesn't that show something about the fundamental difference between philosophy and science?
Yes, but let's see what exactly it tells you. One way, let's say, Lawrence Krauss would say that what it tells you is that philosophy is always, spinning the same wheels and not making any progress, and therefore it's useless. What I would take out of that example, which, by the way, I agree that I think that would be Aristotle's reaction, is that, in fact, the kinds of questions, the kinds of issues that the philosophy deals with are different from the kinds of issues that science deal with, and that if we condemn philosophy for, let's say, not having made progress since Aristotle on ethics, which of course is not true. I mean, we got Mill and we got Kant and we got all sorts of other people, right? But if we buy into that, we basically automatically buy into a definition of progress that uses science as a model. Well, at that point, the deck is stuck, and obviously we're going to lose.
Right. I mean,
but I reject that definition.
I agree with you, and I mean, in some ways, I don't think. I think philosophy has made lots of progress because I think philosophy, partly pressured by science, has radically re-articulated our conceptual landscapes. So we don't just have Aristotle's theory of the right and the good. We have Kant, we have Mill, we have utilitarianism, we have we have evolutionary. So we have many more conceptual resources. We've exploded our concepts of things, and that's a kind of progress. Do you guys agree with that or disagree with that?
I agree completely.
And even if you take virtue ethics, by the way, I consider myself a virtue ethicist essentially, but I wouldn't agree with everything that Aristotle said. And modern virtue ethics has in fact criticized and rejected some of the things that were coming from Aristotle, just like a modern utilitarian like Peter Singer would reject the original Bentham version, let's say, of utilitarianism, or even much of the stuff that Mill said. So there's progress in that sense because you stake out a position, then people start looking at it and saying, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. Here's why it doesn't sound right. Here's what an alternative is, and so on and so forth.
But here's another difference, though. I don't know if this is bad or good, but it just strikes me as a difference about the continuing relevance of the great dead philosophers and not the continuing relevance of the great dead scientists, right? Not in the same way. Is that philosophy is much more dialectical than the sciences. Philosopher thinks it's worthwhile to have a dialogue with Aristotle. Modern cosmology doesn't think it's worthwhile to have a dialogue with Newton. I mean, you teach Newton as something over, but you don't have a dialogue with it. Is that a big deal or a small deal or what? And this will be your last comments.
I think it is right on the mark, but the reason for that is because there is in fact still something valuable that Aristotle, Kant, and Mill have to say to us today. A bunch of other philosophers don't. By the way, we don't talk so to speak to all the dead philosophers. We only talk to the best. Right? We pick and choose over 2.5 millennia. Some of them still have something to say to us, which marks philosophy as somewhat different, not radically, but somewhat different from science.
Massimo, this has been a great conversation, and I thank you so much for joining us.
It's been my pleasure.
Our guest has been Massimo Pigliucci. He's a professor of philosophy from the City University of New York. He's author of Answers to Aristotle, How Science and Philosophy Can Lead Us to a More Meaningful Life. Notice that's together. So, John, are you reconciled to the reconciliation of philosophy and science, or what?
No, they're both very, very problematic. We've had all these years, and we don't know what right and wrong is. They've had all these years. They can't give us anything coherent to say about time. It's all mainly of value because it keeps people like us off the streets, Ken.
Yeah, you're such a pessimist, John. I'm an optimist. I'm going to believe that it's all going to come together in the great end of inquiry someday, and we're going to see the truth of both. But you know what? The end of inquiry is not here, and we keep this conversation going on our blog, theblog.philosophytalk.org, where our motto is cogito ergo blogo. I think, therefore I blog. And now, let's do something different. Let's pop some corn, sit back. It's time for Philosophy Talk Goes to the Movies.
Ken, I really enjoyed the movie Flight. It starts out like a thriller with Denzel Washington doing an incredible job of piloting a plane that would crash under the control of anyone else in the world. But as it continues, it's less of a thriller than a character study and presents real moral quandaries. Denzel Washington is a drug addict and a alcohol abuser, and indeed was drunk and under the influence of cocaine when he performed his heroic feat. But how should he be treated? And from here on in, it might be a little bit of a spoiler alert, because we're going to go beyond what's made clear in the preview. The FAA holds a hearing. They establish that no one else could have done this. They know darn well he's an alcoholic who was drunk, but they can't really prove it. They give him an out. He can blame a compelling bit of evidence on someone else, indeed a stewardess who's dead. Should he do so? Should he deprive the airline world of a gifted pilot by blaming the evidence that points to him on a dead stewardess?
Denzel Washington has all these opportunities to redeem himself, right? And all he has to do is be clean and sober, and he'll get off, and he'll be a hero. But he cannot resist at a critical moment taking another drink. I mean, one of the things about this movie, Flight, is it's this deep journey into the psychology of addiction, because there's a beautiful scene in which the only thing in the scene is a small bottle of vodka from one of those hotel refrigerators sitting on top of the refrigerator. And the director, Robert Zemeckis, holds that shot for a long time. And then the next thing you see is a hand grabbing it. And then the next thing you see is Denzel Washington completely drunk, right? And this is at the moment when he could have saved himself. I mean, this movie, I think, really challenges the idea that we're just governed by our own will. I mean, Denzel Washington wants his life back, but he just cannot get it back. And do you think that's psychologically realistic, or do you believe that we could just by an act of will overcome such things?
No, I think it is psychologically realistic. I think addiction, as presented by Denzel Washington, is kind of an extreme case of something we all find, which is the way things work is you see something, in his case a little bottle of liquor, maybe a bagel, maybe you get the aroma of some high caloric thing coming out of a bakery. And that sensation, that perception, triggers a desire. It's not that you haven't had the desire before, but the desire comes to the surface and it begins to grow. It begins to recruit other things to help it. And that's when you have to resist. And what do you have to resist with? Other desires. So it's not, life isn't a matter of kind of having this high-arching reason that controls your life. It's a matter of having these competing desires and the contingency of life, calling various ones of them to the surface and hoping you have other desires and other beliefs that will counteract them.
Denzel Washington is willing to play this addicted pilot to the hilt. Plays up his heroism, plays up his utter addiction. I mean, one of the things about this movie, Flight, I mean, it's a very disturbing movie. It would have been more disturbing in one way if in the end Denzel Washington could not rise to the occasion and admit his guilt and take the punishment that comes. Do you think Denzel Washington morally redeems himself by the ending?
Yes, I do. I think he makes the right decision not to implicate the stewardess and blame the evidence that he was responsible for, the empty liquor bottles on the plane, on her, even though he could do so and get off. And a utilitarian might say, well, he's such a great pilot, the world would be better having flying planes than in prison. But I think he does the right thing, and I was glad the movie ended on that note.
Because it's certainly more uplifting. I mean, it's certainly more uplifting.
There's one thing that's beyond doubt about this movie, which is that Denzel Washington's performance is absolutely superb. It's definitely worthy of Academy Award. He'll be up against Daniel Day-Lewis, who also put in a superb performance in another movie I've seen, Lincoln. It'll be interesting to see who wins.
No one could have landed that plane like I did. No one.
Flight, rated R, now playing.
You want to hear more Philosophy Talk Goes to the Movies? Keep listening. Our annual Dionysus Award ceremony is coming up next February. Send us your nominations by email to comments@philosophytalk.org.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University, copyright 2012.
Our executive producer is David Demarest.
The program is produced by Devin Strolovich. The director of research is Laura McGuire.
Thanks also to Chris Hoff, Merle Kessler, Dave Millar, Jimmy Tobin, Corey Goldman, and Mark Stone.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from the Templeton Foundation and from various groups at Stanford University, the Friends of Philosophy Talk,
and the members of KALW San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Not even when they're true and reasonable. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org.
I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.